Good evening and welcome to the final session in our weekend of events remembering HMS Hood. This evening we've heard the story of the final hours of the ship and an opportunity to see that remarkable film for years unseen about the recovery of the ship's bell. And we're privileged to have with us now to discuss that film, both the filmmaker, Rob White, and the wreck finder, David Mearns. Rob and David, good evening and welcome to you both. And David, can I start with you? I've been looking at the list of major shipwrecks that you've located, and the number is so many that it's difficult even to select out of them. And just first of all, can I ask, how does one start to become a wreck finder?
Well, there's no university you can go to and get a degree in shipwreck finding. So you come to this hobby profession in all different ways. And my route was through marine science, and that was my background. And after getting an undergraduate and graduate degree in marine science, and specifically marine geology and geophysics, where I used the same type of tools that scientists use to characterize the seabed, you could also use those tools for finding lost objects on the seabed. And I decided after graduate school that rather than working for an oil company or continuing on with science, that I wanted to work offshore. And I then was hired by a company that did worldwide search and recovery for the US Navy. And the early part of my career, mostly that meant airplanes and helicopters that crashed in the sea, owned by the US government, or early on, it was during the Cold War, so we used to sneak around looking for things that the Russians left behind and finding those. And partway through the early part of my career with Eastport International, I was given responsibility for finding a major shipwreck in very deep water. It was a high-profile case. It was actually a murder trial. Somebody blew up a ship for insurance purposes and killed half the crew. And I was the expert witnesses and led that search, and it was a success. And that got me on the path. And since then, I just have really specialized in deep water shipwrecks.
So how does it come about? Do people, well, it starts with people contacting you with a problem, with a challenge?
It's all different ways. Yeah, there's, I mean, now I'm in the latter part of my career. I sort of pick and choose and I develop my own projects, but sometimes I'm hired. If people are looking specifically for something in deep water because of my track record, they come to me. I've worked with my company, Blue Water Recoveries, for a long period of time. In the beginning part of it, we were doing salvage on behalf of the owners of cargoes and shipwrecks. So there's a number of different ways, but it's, at the end of the day, it's still a very, very niche sort of field of expertise. There's no industry that you can go knock on their doors and say, I'm a shipwreck hunter, or, would you hire me one day? You really have to be ready for the time that people need that expertise. And to be sort of upfront where they want to select you, you have to have a very good track record to be able to be in the prime position for people to hire you when that event happens, because you cannot predict when a client is going to need you looking for a shipwreck or an aircraft.
And in fact, it was you that found the wreck of the bulk carrier Derbyshire, and thereby helped to solve a mystery, but also to lay the foundations for improved regulations about sea freight. Yes,
Derbyshire was really, I mean, I've had the fortune of finding some very, very important shipwrecks: Hood, Sydney, the Musashi, and but I think the Derbyshire, in terms of significance, is probably the most important, because it led to these tightenings of the rules in terms of bulk carriers, and it's saving lives at sea today. That whole investigation. So it was hugely important. And of course, still also, you know, one of the major merchant ship losses in UK history. So it was a very, very important part of it. And that's how I met Rob.
Well, I was going to now bring in Rob, because first of all, Rob, it's to ask you about your own background, because how did you first of all become involved with the Hood? You had a long distinguished background in radio and television, but what actually led to the start of the interest in the Hood?
Well, it really comes back to my father, who actually had a contact, a link to Ted Briggs, the sole remaining survivor of the three who survived at that time. And he put me in touch with him. And I was working in IT, and there was a department called IT and Factual, which was run by a chap called Julian Ware, who David mentioned, not my name, but was in that meeting, that critical meeting. And Discovery USA were doing a big ship series. And I thought, well, perhaps that will make a documentary. So it comes back to my father, who was in the Navy for 30 odd years. I'm going to have to just turn my light out. This is him. He can certainly wear a uniform, my dad, as you can see. He looks splendid in naval uniform. Let's put the light back on. And that really began the process. At that time, I was working full-time on Channel 4 News, on Home Affairs, actually, and I would do this in the evenings. And in the end, I fell to talking, with David about the possibility of finding this. Actually, as a matter of fact, it was when, as the film says, it was after the Derbyshire showing that David first mooted this, and I was all for it. And what very nicely happened was that I went through the Royal Navy, couldn't help us, went through the Icelandic patrol vessels, without telling them, by the way, that my father had not served his 3-month sentence for hitting one of their trawlers during the Cold War. Actually, the trawler hit him, but he was actually sentenced 3 months imprisonment solemnly, so he couldn't go to Iceland. And eventually ended up with the Royal Danish Navy, who were terrific. And this is the first voyage, and David was striving mightily to get funding for discovering the wreck. This voyage, we took veterans, so you saw something of that in the film, had a service on board the ship, and they were treated us really like royalty, the Royal Danish Navy. They were absolutely wonderful. So that's how this thing developed. And I've never forgotten the moment when newsrooms being chaotic newsrooms, I'd written to, because in those days you're still writing letters, I'd written to the Danish Admiralty and said, do you think you can help us? And somebody said, oh, there was a letter for you. Oh, it's here. You know, if you've ever been in a radio TV newsroom, it is absolute chaos. Not on my desk, I may have, but on most people's. And there was this wonderful letter saying, yes, we can help you. We'll clear it with the First Order of the Admiralty. And we had the most fantastic help from them. Everything was provided for us. I wasn't going too long, but one of the things that sticks in my mind, apart from the fact they threw wonderful parties for us at every opportunity when we joined them after Iceland, we went out to, as near as we knew, the wreck site, but we hadn't found it then, the precision. David had found it. And all sorts of things were done for us. And one thing I really liked was they suggested that they held a service on the flight deck, as you probably saw, took the roses to the side, and I was watching the helmsman, and you know these ships nowadays, they punch codes in, and there's a tiny wheel, none of this sort of stuff like this. And this chap had they were very efficient there, they were a very relaxed crew, and he was draping a bucket in this beautiful red cloth and tying it with a silken white cord. And I said to the captain, what's that, Sven? What's that for? And he said, yes. You know, we thought for the roses, not very nice to have a bucket. So we thought we would make it look nice. And that was the story of how well they looked after us. They were fantastic.
Now, I want to ask about the story of the film, but first I'd like to go back to David and ask about the location, because we heard earlier in David Hobbs' talk about how the Hood went down in the Denmark Strait, and then looking at that huge expanse of sea between Greenland and Iceland, it's just immense. How does one possibly find a wreck in that amount of sea, and I guess in quite deep water?
Yes, it's. I mean, I've done much deeper wrecks, but we located Hood at a depth of 2,800 meters, and so you know, where do you start? It's quite an obvious thing, but I say the first rule of shipwreck hunting is you need to look in the right place. So where you need to start is with the archival information, the positions that were reported at the time, and not just the positions, but every single piece of navigational information, courses, speeds, latitude, longitude, ranges, bearings, on and on and on and on, every single clue that you get. But the positions are the most important. And because there were quite a number of ships involved, you know, you had the 4 protagonists, the 2 Germans and 2 British. You also had Norfolk and Suffolk, and you also had aircraft aloft actually watching the action. One plane actually saw Hood blow up and sink. So there was quite a bit of information. And I think at the end I had about 6 positions to deal with. Bismarck's I could throw away for various reasons. But the most important turned out to be the squadron navigator. I believe he was a Lieutenant Commander Warrand. And he was the chap on the bridge of Hood when she was fatally damaged and it was clear she was sinking. There wasn't even, Ted Briggs would say, there wasn't even a sort of a abandoned ship call. It was just obvious. Commander Warrand actually opened the door, or the door was open, and actually motioned for Ted to step off first, and Ted did. And obviously we know Ted survived and Commander Warrand didn't. And so I've always remembered that story, and it meant a great deal to me in the end when I looked where we found Hood. And the search area was 600 square nautical miles. So an area that's 30 by 20 nautical miles. It's huge. Warren's position was the most accurate of all of them. So that was something I always remembered, and it meant even more to me that I could tell both his daughter and son, Joanna, and his son who lives in Australia, who actually came to sea with Philip and I on the expedition in 2012, where we attempted but failed to recover the bell, that it was, their father who was the most accurate. So he's the one that I relied on the most.
I was going to ask exactly that. What is it like then? What does it mean for descendants of people who were lost with the Hood? What does it mean to know that the location of the wreck has been found?
It's probably the single most important thing after they, and whether it's a fresh casualty or one many, many years later, once that grief is gone, and particularly in an instance like this where there are questions about it, because the question was, how could Hood, the mighty Hood, the most feared and powerful and ship afloat for 20 years, be lost in a battle in mere minutes? People have questions, and the first question, obvious, a factual one, is where is the ship? And then it's what condition it is, and then explaining why it sank so quickly and why so many people died. And that really does help people. And certainly Joanna's been back to the site, her brother's been back to the site, and even if other relatives cannot go back to the site, through our technology, the telepresence of our imagery, we can help to sort of connect them in a way with that site, and it's a sacred place now. And so I, in my experience, there's absolutely no doubt this is an important thing to do for people.
If I can jump in too, it's very important for one of the only 3 survivors, Ted Briggs. David will remember that we brought Ted out once David had found the wreck of Bismarck. We had a beautiful day for the ship transfer, and David was absolutely keeping intense focus, because it's very easy when you're transferring ship to ship to slip, even if you're a youngster, and break an ankle. It didn't happen. He did come on board in the survival suit. It was a very well prepared line. He said, "I can't recommend the tailor. If you've ever seen survival suits, you look like a complete idiot. You're standing there like this, you can't get the damn thing off." And we did then. David then enabled Ted to press a button which released a beautiful bronze plaque. Of course, we couldn't have all the names written on the plaque, but David had this very clever idea of inscribing it beautifully in a memorial book, which was then put onto a CD-ROM and then put in a pressure-resistant, clear casing. So the names are all there. The same, by the way, true with the Bismarck site. And Ted was able to press that button, release it. You may have seen it in the film. And he said afterwards that he felt he'd at last said goodbye, that for 60 years he'd borne this. And it was real PTSD, really, but he coped with it, like so many did, but some people just can't. And it was a great moment of release for him that he said proper goodbye to his friends. And all of that, that was enabled by David. David did that.
It must have been an amazing experience and to see him, because in a matter of the amount of shock he must have had in a matter of minutes to see the entire ship go up, and then all the experience of somehow escaping, and then the rest of his life almost, I guess, replaying some of those experiences. And so in a way, finding the location made a difference.
Oh, huge difference. But I mean, David can take on here because he's the guy who did it. But that's very important. And Ted, towards the end of his life, it was, I think, becoming harder for him. In the services, for example, he would read that beautiful passage, no man hath a greater love than this, and he laid down his life for his friend. And he found it more and more hard to get through it. And in fact, I think he didn't do it anymore. Before David found the wreck, and I think, David, you'll agree that we could see the transformation, couldn't we, in Ted when he came on board?
Yes, when every year before the wreck was found, we'd have the service, the annual service at Boulder Church, and Ted would read the naval prayer, the ode, and he'd always break up, and sometimes he would cry, but he'd always break up. His voice would break, and we had a service like that on the ship after the wreck was found, and we brought Ted out. So everybody was there. Eric Rose were there. We all said something, but Ted was given the honor of again saying the naval prayer and the ode, and his voice was clear, didn't break at all. It's the first time I ever heard him get through the entire thing without choking up. So he was. I like to believe that it really, he said himself, we laid a ghost to rest. And I like to believe in his mind until the time that he finally passed, that he was able to sleep a lot easier, knowing that the wreck had been found. And he had personally had an involvement with it.
I mean, the two documentaries, the long documentaries, are they're called The Battle of Hood and Bismarck. One is about Bismarck and finding Bismarck, and one's about Hood. And we filmed both ends of when David, once he was absolutely sure, told Ted that on the phone that we found. This was before Ted came out and joined us via Iceland. And I remember he put the phone, we just stayed away from him. He puts the phone down, he goes into his kitchen, he looks out the window. Remember this, David said, he's done it. He's only gone and done it, referring to David. And I think that was a really climatic moment. And then, of course, he came to join us, and it was lovely to see him. He was a very great guy. He was always insistent, I'm not a hero, I just survived. But he did speak for all his shipmates. And in the end, he was the only one who he lost. And he was a very, very, very gentle man in both respects.
Rob, I was going to ask, how did the film come about? Because it would be a strange thing to go to a fairly hard-nosed executive on a TV channel with a tight grip on a budget and say, look, we've got this idea, we'd like to go and film an expedition on a wreck nearly 3,000 meters below the surface and recover the bell and take it. I mean, how did you manage to make the case to the funders?
That's really, David did that. But I'll tell you one story. I really didn't think they'd do it. And I can remember, that you have those moments in your life, you remember where you were, what you were doing. I was driving home from dropping my son at the Royal Academy of Music, because he used to do the young people's sessions when he was a teenager or before. And I remember being rung up, and I was absolutely stunned. And it's absolutely down to David. He tells you that very interesting story about Tim Garland, whom I used to work for on Newsnight, actually. He was a pretty mercurial character, Tim, I can tell you. He was a program editor, and with about half an hour to go, he'd be leaning over people's shoulders, looking at their scripts and going, "Oh, that's terrible, it's rubbish, it's awful. No, you can't do that." And these are complicated scripts, Newsnight's like with graphics and interviews and God knows what else. And then he'd turn to me and say, that's no good, Rob. Rewrite it. And I said, oh, yeah, certainly, Tim. What do you want? Because I was his special assistant. So I was, and he'd say, oh, just rewrite it. And I would rewrite it. I don't know what he wants. Tab. And you go, yes, it's much better. Fine. And I don't, any magic to me. I just think he wanted it. So he's quite a mercurial guy. But where it's paid off is in that lovely story that David told, because it is really down to him, David, that is, that this happened. That he was prepared to take that, and that was part of his character. He would take that risk, and it's, as David implied, it's very hard to find people in broadcasting can do that, and it's very understandable. This was, I think, was it not, David, the most expensive thing they'd ever done? I think Channel 4 at that time.
Well, they had never done anything like it in terms of. It wasn't the cost of the programs, the cost of the expedition was about 3 times the cost of the programs themselves. Yes. So it was a big gamble. And that's the main thing, the gamble. No search is guaranteed. I have a very good track record of finding ships, but I'm the first to tell any client, listen, there's no 100% guarantee in this situation. And we were looking for not 1, but 2 shipwrecks. We were looking for Bismarck and Hood. And even though Bismarck had been found before, they never publicly announced the position. So it was looking for 2. And basically it was, all the research and preparation over a period of about 6 years, being ready for that moment when we got a sniff that Channel 4 were up for this type of gamble. And it was a pitch that I and Julian Ware gave to Tim Gardam. He was one of probably only 4 or 5 people in the UK, head of a channel or a controller of a channel that actually could green light an expedition of that magnitude. And what I was astounded by was I prepared this presentation and all this detailed and facts and figures and technology and ships and on and on and on. And the first 15 minutes of that hour-long meeting was Tim Gardam selling me. And basically he said, these are my bona fides. He actually, as I recall correctly, had a family connection to the German side to crew on the Bismarck and laid all of that out. So in the first 15 minutes, I knew we had the money, and then it was a question of just putting it all together. But it was being ready for that moment when somebody had the appetite. And it was a tremendous gamble, but it paid off for Channel 4, because not only did we do these television programs, we did live news. We set a Guinness World Record on the expedition for the first live internet broadcast from the bottom of the ocean at 2,800 meters. Our ROV footage went live from the ship to a satellite, from Paris to London onto the internet. And we were doing that in 2001. And alone, that technology cost us several £100,000. And we were given a Guinness World Record for it. So it shows you what a groundbreaking expedition it was, not just for me, but for everybody involved and Channel 4.
I must jump in here and say that the point about, no guarantees of finding wrecks is very well amplified by Bismarck. David had to start afresh, did what he always does. He does an enormous amount of work without setting foot on a ship and public records and the like to get the groundwork prepared. And despite all of that, and despite having somebody from, it was Fatalis, wasn't it, David, doing some very fancy positioning for us and so on at the Bismarck wreck, despite the fact that the previous expedition they got to Bismarck only, and there was a Russian ship, wasn't it? And they were so proud of what they'd done that they actually put the plot up on the television news program so that you could actually see it. Despite all of that and all the preparation, we were, and David must take this on because he knows better than I do, we were having very considerable difficulty, despite everything that we knew and all the work David had done in finding Bismarck, which we did do, well, David did. But tell us more about that, David, because that was quite a cliffhanger.
Yeah, it's actually, in one sense, I was too good, because there's 2 parts of an expedition. It's the search with the sonar, and then you film it with a submersible called a remotely operated vehicle, or an ROV. Well, I had planned the search in a way that my line went right through the debris field and went right over the top of the shipwreck. And these sonars have a peculiar blind spot directly under the towfish called the nadir. So this massive shipwreck, 50,000 tons of twisted steel, is directly under sonar where we can't see, but to the sides I could see the debris. So we then started to dive, and this was on the side of a submarine volcano, and the slope was like this. Well, the Bismarck hit here. This is where all the wreckage was, and then the hull slid down this slope, 1,500 meters, till it bottomed out. And that was the difficulty, not finding the wreckage, was actually finding the hull. And so it was the second part of it. And so if I wasn't so careful with my lines in the beginning, it would have made the second part of my job a lot easier.
We were dealing with a group from Oceaneering Technologies, who are a fantastic team, and David, of course, worked with them before. He had his own company, and they're kind of a buccaneering lot. They have sort of bandanas around their heads. And on an earlier occasion with Derbyshire, when I was being rung by the reporter Rory McLean, who was out on the Derbyshire expedition with David, saying, "Don't tell any of the editors, but they lost the sonar." And what had happened was the cable had parted, and that meant that David could put down the ROV, which was not paid for, and recover it. And I remember one of these guys, this gives an idea of their sort of mood, and I'll tell you a further story, saying to camera, "You know, we don't call that losing. We call that deep ocean storage," which meant this thing sitting on the bottom. But anyway, when we got near the hull, and we were running out of time for our Bismarck part before we went off to do Hood. And David was in one control room, and there's a control room which I don't quite understand why. David would explain in a moment. Saw the images first, and David was saying, "Well, can you see it yet?" And they were going, "No, I can't see anything, David." And momently, "Can you see anything now?" "No, I'm not seeing anything at the moment, David." And then, of course, this fantastic sight swam into view, the stern of Bismarck, where the stern fell off, and you could see the swastika, which had been painted out by the crew of Bismarck, because it was used inshore, close in, as an identifier for their own aircraft. And there was I think there was some fairly rich language from David towards these guys who've been tagging him along a bit. But that was a moment, all right, David, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. The producers knew what they were doing. I mean, basically, it's there's no light underwater, so you can only see, your cameras can only see as far as the lights go. Well, lights only go about 10 meters or so. So beyond that, it's complete pitch darkness. But we have sonars that I can actually see much further. So the sonars we navigate by get to targets, and then we can see them. Well, we had been looking for Bismarck, for the hull, the one that slid down the slope, for, countless hours. I mean, there was one time we were up for about 55 hours or some ridiculous number. We didn't know whether it was breakfast or dinner or whatever. And these guys could see the hull, hundreds of meters ahead than what I was seeing. And, they knew it, and the producers knew it, and everybody knew it. And I'm looking at this video, and all I can see is 10 meters. And then I'm seeing the shadow of something big. And I said, "What the hell is that?" And then they go, "It's the Bismarck." Well, they knew what they were coming up to, and I didn't know. But the thing is, as soon as I knew they had pulled a fast one on me, because you could not miss 45,000 tons of steel on these sonars. So I knew what they were doing. So I chucked my microphone down, but I was just delighted that we had finally found the hull, because obviously that's what we wanted to film. That was really, in one sense, Bismarck is really destroyed, but the hull itself is still a beautiful shape. You look at these ships and you have respect for them in terms of what they are as naval architecture, and as badly damaged as Hood is, and Bismarck obviously was pounded by the British, but still the hull, its shape is still there.
Yeah, and the other thing was, we're operating with a lot of light at these depths, and occasionally you'd see there were sort of two creatures we saw, weren't there, David? I remember saying to David, "These creatures, they're like a little crayfish or something." There's a little fish as well. I said, "Are they blind?" And he said, "Well, if they weren't before, they are now, because of this light, you see." But of course, they've evolved, haven't they, David, to find their way completely without sight, haven't they? These particular.
Yeah. They've got big eyes, but they can't see.
Yeah.
Now, while we've been talking, Eric Walker has sent a message. Eric was yesterday in discussion with an old school chum of his, Lindsay Taylor, who I think you'll both know because Lindsay was the live reporter on the Hood survey boat. Eric says that Lindsay showed him photos of polystyrene cups, which had been put in a string bag and taken down with the ROV. They came back the size of large thimbles, and Lindsay had said that the ROV images showed there was a lot of implosion damage to the structures on the seabed due to the extreme pressure. And Eric's just put a PS. He said, would you believe it? Lindsay just messaged me. He's watching us live now on YouTube.
Hi, yeah. Lindsay. Hello, Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay.
Yeah. Lindsay got sort of parachuted in. Well, actually, it was by a ship, but he was assigned the job of being the live reporter because, as I said, we had this novel. I mean, there were only two systems in the world that could do what we did, which was this live broadcast. And because of that, Channel 4 realized, my God, let's get a reporter out there. We're making news. And Lindsay was that reporter. And Lindsay is a sailor. He has a boat, so he was very good about it. But we would have these live slots and we would practice them. 2.5 minutes. Okay, you got 2.5 minutes. We're going live from the Denmark Strait, and I remember, just pulling one of these off was like a huge journalistic and reporting and broadcasting coup. And we had a couple of them that worked, but one. Lindsay and I practiced it, a number of times, stepping it through, and literally we're going in, they're counting us down, 3, 2, 1, and we lost the signal. And they said, that's it, I'm sorry, we can't do it. And the difficulty was, at that high latitude, our satellite only had about a 10-degree beam, of which our transmitting equipment had about a 10-degree beam. So all our ship had to do was roll about 3 meters from one to the other, and we would lose that lock. And when we lost the lock, you just don't get it back right away. And Lindsay cursed up a storm because, this was his big moment, sent out to record these things live. But we did get a couple of them done. And as I said, we set a Guinness World Record for that.
We had a French technician actually it was kind of box, wasn't it, high up in the ship, and he liaised with our tech guy, who wasn't the happiest of bunnies because he was absolutely exhausted when he came on the trip because he'd just done the general election. The technical challenges are huge for that, and he's sort of been volunteered. He was very good at his job. And the problem was he didn't speak French, and the French guy didn't speak English, and so the communication between them was often quite fraught. I can't remember his name. Was it something like Jules? Are you there, Jules?
All I know is he smoked gitans, smoked gitans the whole time. So we had this 20-foot container, and because we needed it to be without obstructions, I put it on a platform high up on the ship, and we would just see smoke coming out of this 20-foot container with this, or 10-foot container, whatever.
I think you needed them.
The higher you're up on a ship, obviously you roll a little bit more. So that sort of was the balance we had to get right. But we pulled off a number of live broadcasts, which was quite a remarkable thing. All of us, Jon Snow, all of the anchors, everybody connected with the channel really were really embedded and committed to this project.
Now, with us also are 4 more of the participants this weekend who I'd like to welcome in now to the Zoom room. Commander David Hobbs, who earlier this evening told us about the Hood and the Bismarck. Admiral Philip Wilcocks, the president of the Hood Association, the HMS Hood Association chairman, Commander William Sutherland, and naval historian Graeme Lunn, who also joined us earlier today. And you're all most welcome and all free to join the discussion. And in fact, I'd like to ask you all this question. Did you ever expect that the Hood would be located at that distance down, at that depth of water?
Well, being the shipwreck hunter, I should probably answer that. Yeah. I'd be more confident today than I was at that time. The information I had was very good. But I'll tell you one thing I do remember, was a meeting we had with Ted and his wife, Claire. Rob, you were there and your wife was there.
Yeah.
My wife, Sarah, was there. And we met at a pub. And we were trying to basically get Ted's agreement that he would come with us, because he wasn't well enough to go on the Danish expedition a few years earlier that Rob had talked about. And, not having, having Ted there was an important part of it. And there was this question, well, you may not find it. And it was my wife, actually, I think, that somewhat sold the deal, because Sarah, and I think this is the only time in our entire relationship where she's actually said, David will actually do it. But she turned to Ted and said, David will find the hood. And so she was more positive than I was. But, in the end, we found it in 39 hours. I was really proud of that. It was on our third line. It could have been on our first line. But at the end of the day, the credit, I always say this, the credit goes back to the people who recorded the information at the time. And still, it goes down to Commander Warren, the navigator for the fleet, not just the ship, And his involvement or whatever contribution to the whole thing goes down in history, because we owe it to him that the wreck was found, and we owe it to him that Ted Briggs survived.
We are going to mark this. We are having a special service at the church that Joanna, who sadly died quite recently, and she set all this up, St James Garlic Hyde in the City of London. We'll be commemorating him and that on that Monday. And I'm very glad to hear an encomium for navigating officers, because that was my father's speciality in the Royal Navy, as navigating officer.
And going over to David Hobbs, David, this evening, earlier evening, you showed us this very detailed diagram of the movements and direction of the hood. And then it's turned out indeed that data was sufficiently detailed for the wreck to be located.
Yes, that was basically from the Naval Staff History, which was a digest of all the inputs at the time. But largely based on inputs from the various ships, the cruisers and Prince of Wales. If I could ask David, something that always fascinates me, how has the science of the behavior of a wreck as it leaves the surface advanced? I presume they don't just fall straight to the bottom as they fill with water or implode. Do we have a good idea of wreck behavior?
That's a very good question. I would say that we don't have a very good idea. We have a better idea than we did 20 years ago. And the wrecks do fall to the seabed very quickly. And that's why the damage is so great. So you have the damage caused in whatever caused the ship to sink, in this case, the explosions. Then you have the damage as it sinks, and the sinking action itself and the upper hundreds of meters of water is very violent. And the ship accelerates very, very quickly. And then it hits the seabed at a very high rate of speed. So you have impact damage as well. And that ships are hitting the seabed at, depending on the depth and a number of factors, anywhere between 15 and 25 knots.
Gosh.
So a ship that could leave the seabed, leave the surface basically intact, say it was just flooded, can look a wreck on the seabed because that impact is so great. And one of the things that the Hood was, I think, the first one that showed us this, but now we've learned it with Musashi, Yamato, with the Barham, is these World War II wrecks. The cordite was very, very unstable. And of course, we know what happened in terms of Bismarck shell exploding the aft magazines, and that broke the back of Hood, and that's why she sank. But I'm absolutely convinced based on these other expeditions. I felt it at the time, but I think now we have the empirical evidence on the seabed and what happened with Musashi and Barham and a number of other ships, that the forward magazine also exploded or went up because of that violence of the ship sinking, whether she turned over or what happened. You know, she reared up. I mean, we have that from Ted Briggs, and we know that. And so we basically have to study these accident scenes, which could be huge. You're talking, you know, for in terms of Hood, the spread of debris is 2.5 kilometers. So you're talking several city blocks of an explosive event with multiple periods or multiple times when there's debris or when damage is happening. So to sift through all of that and figure it out is very difficult. And probably the most comprehensive investigation was on the Derbyshire, not conducted by me, by the team afterwards, Woods Hole, that actually was able to take huge number of photographs and piece together exactly what happened. So that forensic ability is dependent on how much money you want to spend, particularly at very deep water. So we're learning more and more based on what we've seen and comparing various debris fields to other ones, but we're nowhere near to what you can do on land because it's so difficult at deep water.
It's worth saying, David, isn't it, that if someone wants to see what after a 15-inch, two 15-inch magazines are like when they blow up, look at Barham as she sinks.
Yes.
Because you can actually see a whole side of thick armor being flung back against the port side of Barham as she boats, and you can just about see her bow go up and go down very quickly. Yeah, and it's probably the clearest picture of probably what happened to Hood when that after magazine went up.
Yes, yeah, that the Barham is the best example on the surface to see it. So if people say, you know, I mean, the amazing thing with Hood is the conning tower is over 1 kilometer away. This is a 600-ton piece of structure that is 1 kilometer away from what is clear, what I would call ground zero of the two explosions. And how did it get there? I mean, you know, you'll never know, but you can speculate. But the Barham is one example. And then really what sold it for me was the Musashi, because the Musashi is, again, now the end member of World War II battleship, 70,000 ton, the biggest ever built. The Japanese built 2 of them. And it was pounded by the American aircraft over a period of hours. Torpedoes, bombs, was hit dozens of times, but it ultimately sank very slowly. So it was basically flooded. And as she was going down, literally the last bits of it, the crew heard 2 explosions on the seabed, completely ripped apart, just like Hood. Bow separate, stern separate, midsections completely obliterated. And the only thing that can do that level of destruction is the second explosion. It's not implosion. We did see examples of implosion, and implosion happens in the very, when you sink very quickly and the space is contained, basically airtight, it collapses like that. That's implosion. We saw very minor amounts of implosion, but I don't believe on the bow we saw implosion. And that's what we went back in 2012 to try to figure out as well. But despite we've been there 3 times, haven't we? 3 times, we've only scratched the surface. We've only scratched the surface. And in addition to all of that, now we have 80 years of corrosion, and the wreck is slowly being eaten apart, and it's very hard to see things. So it's a difficult thing. We could talk for hours on forensic investigations.
Lindsay Taylor has got a comment passed through Eric Walker. Lindsay says, David and Rob, here's a recollection you might remember. As David has said, there was no certainty that Hood would be found. Lindsay says, as he recalls, when the wreck was first spotted, there was a real fear she was upside down. which would mean visually there would be very little to see. However, he says he remembers peering at some of the imagery with you, David, and it slowly emerged that she was not upside down.
Well, and essentially the midsection of Hood. So if you look at the two magazines, they're obliterated explosion. The bow and the stern sections of it, large sections, about 70 meters on one and 100 on the other, are not that much, but a big section of the bow and stern are broken off and by themselves in two debris fields. The midsection of the ship, which was over 100 meters, that was upturned. Okay, that we found on the seabed upside down perfectly. Now, once we found the wreck with sonar, to learn the most about a ship, about wreckage, you go for the biggest piece first. And that was the biggest piece. We got to that piece and it was upside down. And I was crestfallen. I was really upset. And Lindsay was on board at the time and he was asking me, multiple times a day, how do you feel? Now we've seen this. How do you feel? How do you feel? And the first day or so, I was really down. Then we found the stern. Then we found the bow. And even though they are badly, badly damaged, they are clear, recognizable sections of the ship that not only an expert like people on this call are, but even the public could see that. There's the bow, there's the anchor, there's the stern, there's the jackstaff, there's certain recognizable things. And I felt a lot better after that because the last thing you want to do is see, just see nothing that connects you. You need something that people can connect to. And probably the last thing we should talk about that really connects the public today and in the future to Hood and the service of the men and the history of the ship and everything she stood for is the bell. And that was the last thing we've done is go back and recover the bell.
And Graeme, just to bring you in for a comment, that this afternoon you were looking back almost a century, in fact, at Hood's visit to Australia, and now the story has come right through to the discovery of the wreck. I just wondered if you would have a question or a comment.
Well, an observation would be that thanks to David and the team, all the people involved in finding Hood, it encouraged the Navy in Australia and the big public push in Australia that perhaps it would be possible to find Sydney. The search area was obviously not nearly as well defined as it was for Hood. But like I say, because David managed to find Hood, it encouraged them down there. And thank you, David. Finding Sydney was very, very important for my nation and my Navy.
And to go over to William now. William, it must have been an amazing feeling when you heard the news that the wreck had finally been located.
Indeed, yes, absolutely. And the years haven't dimmed that one bit. Anyone who saw the response of the veterans, the last few veterans, putting their eyes once again on Hood's bell, cannot fail to be moved. And I think I can speak for the whole membership of the HMS Hood Association, which is over 400 strong and still contains many members of families of people who lost their lives in it. What a great debt of gratitude we owe to David and to Rob for that fantastic recovery of the location of the wreck and eventually recovery of the bell. It means so much to so many people, and it represents prodigious effort and imagination and expertise on their part. And I'd just like to thank them very much.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that is to Paul Allen, who graciously provided his expedition yacht Octopus not once but twice, and obviously all the people connected with that, his entire team donated that so that the bell could be recovered and brought back to the UK at no cost to the UK taxpayer, and we owe that debt to the memory of Paul Allen, who sadly had passed away.
Indeed.
And I think it's worth saying that we have to remember that Hood's three main parts of her wreckage are protected site, as are any naval wrecks, Royal Navy wrecks that have servicemen, servicewomen within them. They are great war graves. But because the bell was found in the debris field away from the three main elements, David and I were able to persuade the Secretary of State for Defence and the First Sea Lord that we should be able to recover the bell without disturbing the war grave. And that's really important because there was concern among some veterans and families that we would be in going to retrieve the bell, we would be disturbing the war grave. And we were able to reassure them from the evidence that was produced by David from the earlier expedition that it was actually the wreckage of the captain's cabin, which had been blown clear of the ship when the after magazine went up.
It's also important to say that on the expedition, when we found the bell, we had made a solemn compact that we would, it has been organised by David, not to touch the wreck, just to look and go away. And of course, the temptation would have been great to try and recover the bell then, but we did not. And it took a lot of work by David and Philip to get the thing on a firm footing, supported by everybody. Even then, there were some people who were not terribly happy about it, but most people were. Ted used to say, "Well, look, someone said to me when I was doubtful about it, but look, if you, if you in the first expedition, you go into a churchyard, you just look, that's all right," because there was doubt even about looking at something like that for that, and then to build on that to get those sort of permissions which David and Philip got was an achievement and very much worthwhile. I mean, we have when the bell was shown in the Jutland exhibition, one of the nice things was people were able to reach out and touch it, and I have an image of that that's going to be at the service on Monday of a lady who is obviously a relative. She's quite senior. She's just reaching forward and touching the bell, and it's that continuity and that contact that I think meant an enormous amount to people.
The whole story is so amazing, and I had a number of questions to ask, but time has beaten us to it. But I'd like to warmly thank you all. And just before rounding off with a fuller thanks, I'd like to say that thanks to Rob, we've got some archive footage that will follow this. It's about a 10-minute video showing actually images of Hood in her prime, and also then images of the search for the wreck. But really, you've all been so fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the technical team for making everything go so smoothly. And I'd like to send a special thank you to Moya MacDonald of Another Orkney Production, AOP. Moya's been wonderful. She'd had the vision and to see the concept and to see what could be done, and the drive and the energy and the belief and the commitment to make it all happen. And I'd just like, in saying goodbye from me and the team, to hand over Philip to you as president of the HMS Hood Association for the final word this evening.
Thank you, Harry. And thanks to, reiterate your thanks to the Naval Regional Commander, Captain Chris Smith, to your splendid team up in Orkney. It's been truly remarkable 2 days. My fellow colleagues from the Hood Association as well. The past 48 hours have, I hope, shone a light on Hood and her service to our country, and more importantly, those who served on board her throughout her 21 years. 80 years ago, Hood cleared Scapa at midnight last night, and at this time is approaching the southeast coast of Iceland. For the 1,415 officers and men, the Orkneys were the last sight of land, and for most of them, that was the last sight of their homeland. By now, they are some 30 hours away from their time in history, their destiny. For those 1,415, they have no graves, but the seas that wash our waters and our shores. So please do remember them and their courage and their sacrifice in the service of our country in 2 days' time on the 24th of May by lighting a candle in their memory. May they rest in eternal peace. Good night and thank you for being with us.